Does the Bible say anything about current events? It certainly does.
It's our focus to be culturally relevant and to communicate a perspective from the Scriptures.
As Christians, we should have a biblical perspective of the news and be able to share that perspective with others.
Hello, I'm Rob Fields, Executive Director of the Leaders of Faith Foundation and co-host on the show with Pastor Larry Bird. Thank you for joining today's news and biblical views. Our desire each week is to discuss some of the current issues in our news feeds, or even we find talking about amongst our friends. We then move towards what faith, truth, and the Scriptures have to say about our topic. Our hope is that you would find it informative, encouraging, and help towards your growth in Jesus. You know, Jesus says that He is the way, the truth, and the life, and there's no better way to explore an issue we're facing than to search the Scriptures to find our hope in Him. You know that also the struggles, despair, and pain we see all around us can consume us from the start of the day, and we don't have to settle with the message ending here, but let's continue on the pathway toward a biblical view. Today's topic is hope in prison. You know, as you watch the news, we see much discussion regarding prison reform. What is life like in prison, and would there be any hope for people serving a sentence? We also see discussions around the matter of what happens when one gets out of prison. There's also the struggle for those who have loved ones who are in prison. I think you will enjoy today's discussion and the message of hope in a very least likely place. I would also like to say that the idea for the show came from a viewer who was watching the show. He contacted me and suggested this topic and some folks who are doing an amazing ministry work in prisons. So today we have with us from Jubilee Ministry is Ryan Newswanger. And Ryan, it is a pleasure to have you, to be able to enjoy a little bit some of the discussion with what's going on in prisons and really a message of hope too. So glad that you're on the show.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So first, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself? I always like to hear a little bit of background and how you even got into a ministry or work like this and addressing with what prisoners, and then also where Jesus became part of directing in your life too.
Sure. Many people in our field and working within prisons and with people coming out of prison don't often set out to do that work. And I would be similar. My training is in construction and architecture, and my background as a child, I accepted Christ as a child and grew up in the faith and in a good home. And so I was not on that trajectory early on, but I worked in the construction field for a number of years and got into leadership and management and really felt God's call on my life to be in a role of leadership and really started to pursue that, and then was asked to come to Jubilee Ministries and oversee the thrift stores. And so kind of the business component of our ministry, and then really became impassioned with this idea of life change and people truly changing their lives, and that happens through Christ. And so that has been my passion for the last several years in working at Jubilee.
Yeah, great. And also, as when we talked too, your wife Amber, tell us a little bit, when you met, it was kind of fascinating on this, because we've heard of high school sweethearts, but I think you topped this one.
Yeah, we first met, she was 10 years old, and she knew early on and even told her grandfather that she knew who she was going to marry. And we started dating unofficially when she was 14, but officially at 16, and been together ever since.
Wow, yeah, that's a great story on that. So, well, you know, when we're talking about the prison and prison reform, there's a lot in the news, and we can pull up different things from the major networks that have talked about prison reform. I guess my first question, what do you mean by this when we're talking prison reform and what we've seen in the news?
Sure. You know, so reform can be a lot of different things, and I think where it's coming from is people are seeing a need for change, and what is there is not working. But for us at Jubilee, we really see and work towards this heart change, and that real change happens in someone's heart. And there's a lot of external things that we can do and do, and those are important, but we really focus on the change of the heart, and we believe that change happens through Christ.
Wow, and that's one of the key parts right there, is a real dramatic change, but also eternal change that's taking place. Jubilee is in many prisons, and I have to be honest, many of us and even viewers may have not even stepped inside a prison to know what's going on. In fact, the closest I ever been was when I was doing painting down in Delaware. There was a new prison facility and went in and painted the new construction. That's about extent, and I've seen some of the bars and some of the other things. But describe to us a little bit about what life is like, or what's on the inside when we're talking about the prisons.
Sure, there are plenty of walls and bars and barbed wire, and that's all true. And there are men who spend a lot of time in cells, but in a lot of prison there's a lot of common space where many of the inmates will gather for large portions of the day. State facilities are often much larger than a county facility, so there can be thousands in a state facility where there's hundreds in a county. And so some of the state facilities really have, they have libraries, they have very large kitchens, they're very large laundries, and they have opportunities for inmates to do different kinds of training. And many have a chapel, and that's where we become involved. And they can be very different, much like our churches today. Our church buildings can be very different. They're different inside the prison, and so sometimes we can have groups of about 20, and sometimes we can have a chapel of 300. And so it will vary greatly, but we are certainly glad to have the opportunity that there are chapels and that we can serve in that way.
So it's like a little city within the walls, and community that's there.
Very much so. It's a large amount of people living in one space, and you still need to provide all the services that people need to live. So.
Right, and I'm sure that there's some challenges that you face as they're in there too, in a small living quarters too. People can be people. It's like we all get along and we love one another, right?
Yeah, it's difficult when, just think, no matter who it is, if you're putting 20, 30, 50 people in a small space for a long period of time, there's going to be tensions, and there's a lot of personalities, and a lot of people are vying for position, and so there is certainly a lot of challenge inside.
Yeah, so what are some of those ministry opportunities that you have as being within the walls here, and as you kind of described, working with prisoners and even the staff, and what is it like ministering in there?
Sure, so there's a lot of opportunity, and we really view our chaplains as missionaries, and we are going to a different land, and this land has its own language sometimes. It has its own culture, and so there's a lot of differences, but also, people are people, and so it can be, we can go cell to cell, minister to people one-on-one. It can be us having small groups where we're doing Bible studies. They can be prayer groups. And then it can be a full church service. And so in some of our facilities, there's a full church where, there's 300 people in the pews. There are elders in the church. There is a choir. There is a worship team. There are announcements. Very similar to what our church would be like on the outside, it is on the inside. And I've met, some men who have, been in prison for 25 years, but they've also been an elder of the church for 20 years. And they are faithfully serving the Lord. And we have seen the church is very much alive inside the walls. And that is such an encouragement, because we see guys who have totally changed the way they used to live.
Wow, that's amazing. A lot of times we would never imagine the Greater Sea Church and the scope that it has in the different places and least likely places that it's actually meeting. And that those church meetings and those Bible studies is what really helps out genuine reform that's going on with some of the challenges.
Yep, and it's just, getting into people's hearts and changing, taking the focus off themselves and focusing on Christ and how to live for Him.
Sure. Well, Ryan, we're going to take a break and we're going to come back and dive into this a little bit more. Thank you so much for being on today's show. We'll come back after this message. Welcome back to today's news and biblical views, and I'm Rob Fields, and also with co-hosting with Pastor Larry Bird. as we do a tag team of working the show together. During the COVID crisis, I've been on the show doing interviews and having individuals, and then at other times he's come on the show and he's interviewed different folks at time. We're just trying to maintain a little bit of the spacing, but we're glad that you're back. Today we're talking with Ryan with Jubilee Ministries because we're talking about hope that is in our prison system. Ryan, we talked about a lot within the news of prison reform, and the topic of reentry has been in the news as well, and I made reference to that. We go back even at the presidential, the conventions, the Republican National Convention. I know that President Trump actually featured an individual that was in prison and had a prison ministry and talking about some of the prison reforms. So it was front stage even at the Republican National Convention and other news agencies that's talking about prison reform. So I guess my question is first too, I just don't want to make an assumption. It's a term that's floating out there, the topic of reentry. What is reentry when we're talking about that?
Sure. The simplest way to say it is it's people who have been in prison who are now re-entering society. And so the big question is, how can that happen in a good way? And the sad fact is that many who are released from prison end up going back. In fact, I think it's over the course of 5 years, 75% of the people who are released end up back in prison. And so there's been a real focus on what does reentry look like and how can that be done well so that these folks are not coming back into the prisons.
Wow, 75% would have never imagined on that. So repeating and a revolving door on that. So what are you guys doing, Jubilee, and I'm sure there's other works out there, but specifically Jubilee, how are you guys really tackling or dealing with this reentry? I'm sure you probably want to work on that 75%, work yourself out of a job in one sense, right?
Absolutely, we would love that. So Jubilee has its own program. We've been doing reentry for more than 25 years and working with men coming out of prison. And so we have a facility in Lebanon where men come to, they live there, they work there, and we really look for them and teach them how to live God's way. And it's changing these old habits and these old ways of life that got you in trouble in the first place. And so we're doing Bible studies, we're teaching life skills, they're going to recovery classes, they're learning how to manage money, and they're also working. And so we have a number of thrift stores, and so the men are going to work and learning what work is like, but it's all around this idea of living God's way. And so our program is anywhere from 6 to 12 months, and it varies because it's phase-based, and so there's certain things you have to achieve until you can go to the next phase. And so it's really, we work with each person individually and where they're at and try to get them moving forward and living this new way and living God's way.
So it sounds like a great plan. I'm in. I'm sold on it. I wish we would all do. So is it effective? Do you really see results that are lasting, that it's addressing that 75% on that? How effective is it?
Sure. So yeah, we are seeing results, and probably the most simple thing at the very beginning is just, it's a safe place where you're staying, you're living, we're taking care of, the major needs. But it's getting out of the old cycle, getting out of the prison system, getting out of going back into what you knew before, and it's just living this new way. And so we have a lot of structure, we have a lot of accountability, and so every day they're waking up early. It's going to a Bible study. We're starting out in God's Word. Just this morning, I taught a Bible study to the group of men in our program, and so they're learning. They're then going to work, and so they're working a full day and working a full week. And then the evenings are more classes. It's these recovery classes, the money management, and so we really try to set up this new way of life. So, and if there's any questions, we teach, we counsel, and then hold them accountable to those things.
The beauty of this is you're actually walking with them. It's not just saying, hey, you're just here to figure it out. You and I both know the story very well, the Good Samaritan. Mm-hmm. And what I love about that is finding this person that was in need. And the Good Samaritan went the extra mile, not only just finding a place for him to stay, but in the text it says he was there the next day. Yep. And given that indication that you're walking with and being with them, it sounds like you really get to know them. They're not just a number but they're a person, they're a name. You get pretty close with them, you'd say?
We do, and we realize every person is different. And we have even our staff who work with these men, they're called life coaches. And that's what they're doing, and walking them through all these new things. And it could be something simple of getting a new ID, and who do you call, how do you do that, getting fines and costs straightened out, and we walk them through that. But then it's also, I have my paycheck and I need to deposit money, and how do I do that? And then how do I manage this? How do I live responsible and live God's way? And so we do a lot of work, and realizing that everybody is different, everybody is unique, everybody has their own set of circumstances. Then there's also the relationship component, and so often there's broken relationships, burned bridges. Just recently, we were reconciling a father and a daughter who had been estranged for probably over a decade. And so it was holding this first meeting where the two of them were coming together, and we were in the room with them and working through old pains and old hurts and looking at how to move forward.
Yeah. So, and you kind of touch on this too, would you say that the work is really beneficial to these men? I mean, that having those Bible studies, being in the church service, but also walking with them to get a job, do you really see it's helping them?
Yeah, we see the work component as very, very important. And there's a lot of things that come out in it. And just to share a quick story, we had a man who came to us who was probably in his 50s. And we were showing him how to use the time clock, and he wasn't sure how to use it and didn't really understand it, which is fine, and we taught it. But we realized he really didn't even understand the concept of keeping track of your time. And we asked, you're in your 50s, how have you kept track of time at your other jobs? And he said, my mother was an addict, and my two uncles were drug dealers. And so when I was 12 years old, they had me running drugs, and that's the only job I've ever had.
Wow.
And so we see examples like this where, guys haven't been in a good work environment or have been doing illegal activity. So it's really important, and we find too that many guys know how to work, but not so common is how to be a good employee. And so the tragedy of using drugs, and many of the guys that come have used drugs, and you learn the skill of manipulation to try and lie and cheat your way to get money so you can get drugs, and so you have this skill of manipulation, and then you end up in prison. And you have to be the tough guy, and so you have to defy the authorities to show that you're tough. And so you bring manipulation and defying authorities into the workforce, and it doesn't go well. Mm. And so I know we had a guy a number of years ago, we had to help him do his taxes, and he had 22 W-2s. So he had no problem getting a job, he had a problem keeping a job. And so we do a lot of work with the guys, learning how to be a servant. When you're working for an employee, you're a servant. And so we see a lot of good things come out of that. And then once they fulfill their work requirement at Jubilee, then they're going out into society, getting jobs. And we've seen really good things from that. I have employers calling me all the time. Any guys ready? Do you have any guys? We're ready to hire them. And so we see a lot of good things coming through that.
Well, that's spectacular. I think those are life skills that's good for not only just those that have been in prison, but also for those of us that are not in that. And the beauty of, from what I'm hearing too, is hope in the prison, but also as one is getting out of the prison, is just providing that. We're going to take another break, and we'll come back. Thank you again for being on the show and joining us here, and we're going to continue our discussion about hope in the prison after this break. Welcome back to today's News and Biblical Views. I'm Rob Fields, and today we're talking about hope in prison, and I would even say outside of the prison as well. And we have Ryan with Jubilee Ministries. Ryan, one of the things as we've seen the struggle of reentry and the work that you guys are doing with men that have come out of prison and helping them really just to get acclimated in society. What do you see as the biggest challenges for those that are coming out of prison? What would be some of those hiccups or struggles that they're running?
Yeah, there's several challenges that people can face coming out, and kind of the obvious ones are jobs and housing, and those are real. In today's climate, we've seen the jobs has not been much of a challenge. The housing can be a little bit, but I think the biggest thing that we see is people coming out and they're right away wanting to connect to the people that they know, go back to the places that they were, which is completely natural, is what we would want to do. But it's those people and places that have got them into trouble to begin with. And there's a huge challenge too of just, there's a lot of responsibility when you come out. You have very little responsibility when you're inside, and then you come out and you have all the responsibilities of life, plus the responsibilities of parole and probation. And so guys can get overwhelmed, and when you get overwhelmed, you go back to what you know. And so we see that as the real challenge of just this desire to want to go back. And it's so similar to, if you think of the story of the Israelites and how they left Egypt and they were wandering in the desert. And as soon as things got tough, they said, oh, let's just go back. It was better back there, even though they were enslaved. That's what we know. That's what we're comfortable with. And we see the same things with guys. And just last week, there was a man who came to the point where he realized that he just wanted to go back. And he knew that it wasn't good, it wasn't healthy. He knew that living God's way is best, is going to be the most beneficial for him long term. But going back was just comfortable. And so it's good for us to be there, to have those conversations, to work through that, to help them see how that can affect their future.
Yeah, do you see some of the challenges maybe differ when those in church? I know someone that was in prison, and when he was coming out, one of the biggest challenges that he had was getting acclimated in the church community. Yeah. That little box that you have to check for employment, but then also as you're talking with people, it's like having this, and they've done their time, and they've paid to society. Yep. Sometimes it seems like the churches is not as welcoming as it should be in one sense.
Yeah, we see probably two things, and maybe the two extremes. And so the first one is, this person's going into a church, they don't know anybody, and if they know there's a criminal background, they're kind of kept at arm's length, and we don't know this person, we don't trust this person, and so we just kind of don't associate, and almost kind of, just kept on the outskirts. And then we've seen the other extreme where there's just this overwhelming outpouring of support, and it's so over the top that it's not taken as genuine. And what we hear the most is, just treat me like you would treat any other guest. Don't do anything different. Don't adjust. Just treat me like you would any other guest. And so I think that's just an encouragement for churches. It's not more difficult. It's probably simpler. Just treat them as people. They can see, just like any of us can see, if it's not genuine or there's whispers going on. They're going to know that.
Yeah, I think that's great advice on it. I know sometimes we kind of think of them as like the lepers, like staying away, but just treat them as individuals. Another thought too, and this is kind of a turn. Some people have loved ones that are in prison. What would be some encouragement or some words that you would share with them that we're on that end to where we have someone that's close to us that is in prison?
Sure. The simplest answer is love them, but within that, it goes so much deeper. And so we talk at Jubilee a lot about grace and truth. And real love is both. It's not just grace and it's not just truth. And so there are times where there may be a hard conversation that needs to be had, and that's truth, but that's okay because that's love. But grace is also a piece of love, and so it's just being very real. Love them. The second thing I would say, don't give up. Don't give up. Some of the greatest stories that we have seen have been guys who did not do well the first time in our program, and they ended up going back to prison, but they came back the second time, and they got it. And they saw it, and they went for it. And so love them, don't give up, and keep praying. Keep praying. We hear guys who tell us grandma was praying for 10 years. So keep praying for them.
Oh, well said, well said. Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for being on the show today and the incredible work through Jubilee Ministries. Are you a person that has made a complete ruin of your life? You know that you need God, and although you feel you have no right to turn to God in your current crisis, are you the person who has completely misjudged following Jesus? This understanding is a common but mistaken view that God is a stern judge who is irreconcilable to man's failure. Just think about it. This is the person who has the idea that no man can come to God unless he is entered into rightly or earned the right to come before God, until his life somehow adds up, until he's achieved some unheard standard of righteousness. This is the person who also has in the back of their mind that the church is only for those who have reached perfection and by some right have God's favor. I don't belong, and surely I don't qualify. Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, says Jesus Christ. Dick Halverson, former U.S. Senate chaplain, says about such an understanding, what he failed to realize is that the church is for men who need God's grace, not men who have earned it. Most sincere followers of Jesus are in church not because they are sinless, but we all know that we're sinners. In fact, Jesus himself made it clear he was not able to help the religious people of his day, not because they did not need his help or he could not, but they refused to admit their need. Would we reject his grace and gift? This is grace, undeserved favor. God helps those of us who are not worthy of his help. God helps the weak man, the ruined life, the shipwreck, the more eligible you are for his help. Can you hear Jesus' invitation? Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden. Thank you for being with us on today's news and Biblical Views.